This is An Infinite Path, spoken word essays by Niles Heckman, some of which go on to become our documentary short subject films, half of which release freely here through the podcast, all of which can be found through your support at nilesheckman.com. Most people are good, yet also dysfunctional. Sometimes there are bad dysfunctional folks too, but that's a minority. Primarily because of money and the need to acquire it, usually through honorable means, like professional or responsible employment, there are also ways of acquiring money through unhonorable means. The current human operating system is not all sunshine and rainbows, but instead corruption on a grand scale, because we have systems in place that can work very well for unhonorable operators, while those who do the right thing may not always come out on top. We recently had an interaction with two entities, one being an individual, a little head, and the other a large company, a big head, both of which, because of the same catalyst, showed us 2 degrees of somewhat dishonorable behavior, which we were able to circumvent without being dishonorable ourselves. As both a documentary photographer and filmmaker, we are no stranger to the tool that is a camera, and have had many dozens of both still image catered and video catered camera gear over the years. While a tool is just a tool, a camera is ultimately just a tool for creating art. It's essentially a much more technologically advanced form of the paintbrush, which Claude Monet used to paint hundreds of water lily paintings around the marsh at his home in Giverny, northern France. Much like acquiring quality painting pigments of the past, which the artist oftentimes usually had to make themselves by hand, we have learned to acquire quality hardware for our film and photo outputs. And camera gear is no exception. One huge benefit of good gear is that you can oftentimes resell it, used, for a decent amount toward what you originally paid for it, sometimes even nearly equally as much, while certain other gear does greatly lose value. So if you're savvy about buying used gear, you can get some great tools and save money. We've gotten quite good at buying the majority of our gear used, and then reselling it down the line as we adjust our workflow and pipeline, always streamlining. Some gear is like an automobile, where the moment you drive it off the lot, since it loses value, you'd be a fool to buy new stuff exclusively all the time. There is a photography term called GAS, which means Gear Acquisition Syndrome, as it's commonplace for less creative folks, especially technologically obsessed males, to constantly overbalance time just studying and acquiring gear and not using it well. We look at this behavioral dynamic with the philosophy of Michelangelo creating the Sistine Chapel by painting it, not spending all his time studying the brushes he was going to use to paint it. So as we ebb and flow with our tools, sometimes adjusting them, but oftentimes knowing something numerous years old is perfectly fine, thank you, we have also inherited a general rule to intentionally always be minimum a year or 2 behind in terms of acquiring any sort of camera technology. So that means we'd never buy a new camera right as it's first released, because instead we'd wait to pick one up after it's about a year old. This works to our advantage because there is an inherent tendency in male technology enthusiasts inside the planned obsolescence mindset to always want to acquire hot new things, which is of course the fuel for consumerism. We'll never forget the day we were working at a freelance job in Los Angeles at a company which shall remain nameless because it has both some really excellent people and some unhonorable people, when a young lad, who we had never formally met prior to that point, came into the room in which we were working at and proceeded to pull out his smartphone and cold announce to someone else in the room and ourselves that he had acquired the latest smartphone the evening prior and was walking around the company showing it off, for which we could almost care less. For we knew he would never be a Michelangelo or Monet, but instead a dude who was the type of blob who would stand in line outside a store waiting for the latest release of some product which had minor differences from the previous version a couple years prior, which he had already owned and had minimal differences from, thus only being, shallowly, a paintbrush show-offer and not in any way an artist, creative, or even genius with a lasting positive effect on others, society, or culture. This adolescent and immature attitude is common for tech enthusiasts, and this is why we use it to our advantage when buying used gear. As we know, we might get something that's just a year or 2 old for the price because there is an ocean of these types out there, who acquire gear and again don't really use it for anything truly artistic or timeless, and then want to move on to the next gear in just a season or 2. They'll also likely have collected secondary aspects of the gear, which they'll likely be selling along with listing it at a reduced price, which also works to our advantage. Our main marketplaces for doing this buying and selling have been two websites, one more local and the other more countrywide, and sometimes even international. The first is called Craigslist, an American classified advertisements website with sections devoted to jobs, housing, for sale, items wanted, services, and community-related things, etc. Founded by, yes, a dude named Craig, who began the service in 1995, and to this day it's remained a very basic, simple text-based website for individuals to exchange and buy items through. A comedian of which once joked that it's the perfect place to list that, you give me a hand job, I give you my coffee table. Being a very small company, which has provided a marketplace for honor-based systems of individual to individual or individual to small business commerce. We have both bought and sold on there, doing many cold, non-sexual meetups with people in parking lots for quick exchanges, almost all of which are cool, to swap goods with cash with great success. For as we mature, again, we have adopted a more and more general rule to stay lean and light with our tool collection, only needing the bare minimum of which to be a creator, which oftentimes over the years requires quite a bit of purchase, trial, and error. The other website which we have long used, the more countrywide and international one, is eBay, another American e-commerce corporation, also just like Craigslist, based in the Bay Area of California and coincidentally also founded in 1995, that facilitates consumer-to-consumer and business-to-consumer sales through its website. There have been numerous tech companies from the 1990s early dawn of the Tim Berners-Lee World Wide Web, which grew into major tech giants, many of which continue to adapt and change, some of which improving, but others inevitably degrading in the process by becoming more large and thus malevolent. But eBay had stayed very consistent in its original simple business model, which was essentially just as basic as creating a marketplace for individuals to buy from one another, or individuals to, yes, buy from small businesses. We had long used eBay with no kinks or issues, having an account on there with a very high rating, for we have always remained, you guessed it, honorable in both our buying and selling on that platform, and our profile rating has reflected that. Same with the profile ratings of other sellers we have dealt with on the platform when we are the buyer. Yet something happened on there which changed this high rating to high rating relationship. eBay primarily works as an honor system, and in the past had been the mediator between two buyers if there was a dispute. But recently, since the time of this writing, we purchased a piece of camera gear from a seller on the platform, and after having an issue, we have found that eBay's method of operating in regards to this has changed. Basically, before purchasing from any vendor, it's kind of important to know at least a tiny bit about them prior to the purchase. Just like in the old bazaars of the Middle East, which date back through the sands of time, an individual might go to their favorite stand owner recurringly because they had a previous purchasing relationship with them and knew their vegetables, nuts, meats, etc. they had sold in the past and had certainly quality to them. Anytime a new stand opens in a market, one is always taking a small risk by purchasing from this particular seller for the first time, because of no history or track record together. Our failure this time around was purchasing a piece of used camera gear from a seller who had not been on the website very long, only for a week or two in fact, and they had thus no previous ratings. So we purchased an item, which was a bit over $600 mind you, not exactly cheap, and then after the money went through, it's up to the seller to honor their listing and ship the item to the buyer. In this case, numerous days went by with numerous inquiry messages sent with zero feedback or response. Looking at the seller's account, we could see some other items listed, knowing it was a female seller because one of the other items was a purse, and in the photographs they had taken holding up the items to camera, there were both female fingernails present, as well as a reflection of a very curvy feminine physique in the black screen of the item that we had purchased. We could also tell it was a woman of Latin American descent, a detail which has future importance to the story. So about a week or two went by, nothing had been shipped, and we started to get a bit concerned. For early warning signs tend to only amplify, which were concretized when at the end of week 2, upon logging back into the website and looking at their account, we saw that they had exit scammed, meaning zeroing out or deleting all the content from their account, leaving either no trace or just leaving an empty but not deleted account. A dynamic which is very common in the cryptocurrency space. Never put any money into any venture in which the owners or runners of that venture are anonymous, because that's the launch pad of the primetime exit scam. So when trying to deal with this unhonorable individual who took our payment and never shipped out the item, goddammit, one then looks to the marketplace whose domain they are in for assistance, in this case eBay. And as once I was blind, now I can see. Thinking eBay was a giant tech company that still remained mostly transparent, truthful, or true to their roots, but instead they have adjusted into being very opaque. We once read and always remembered that the number one thing that keeps a small business afloat in the long run is, drumroll, customer service, meaning how you treat your customers after they have purchased from you. As the spiritually degraded commercial marketplace is really there for the acquisition of capital, customer service is a direct barometer of how much a seller actually cares about their buyers and any future relationship they may have with them. We, for example, who sell various documentary and audio products, know that if any individual who purchases from us, one aspect of what we must do to stay honorable is to do our best to make sure they are happy with the initial purchase should they have a question or need some sort of technical support, aiming to always be helpful. This is something that any long-lasting, honorable company that has been around for many decades with a good reputation will be very knowledgeable and hardworking regarding, to make sure that they have had a long-served, pre-existing customer base and have not just blown them off or dumped them by making initial money off them, but instead establishing a relationship of care, which from an honorable business standpoint means one will continue to purchase from you in the future, if not send more business your way through referrals and recommendations. Dark pyramid structures that treat their customers and or employees like they are expendable ultimately will crash and burn. It may take a long time, but the chickens will come home to roost. There was once an electronics store chain in the United States which reigned through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s called Circuit City, an American electronics company known for having very good customer service via non-annoying and overly helpful, but still very helpful and knowledgeable salespeople on their store floors. Their main forte through the years had been home electronics centers and car stereo electronics, and in those early days of the web, most people weren't able to search electronics online. And on top of this, home theater electronics were more complicated back then, with an amp, receiver, or home theater stereo system sometimes looking like some sort of Russian synthesizer, with knobs, dials, gauges, and remote controls, with buttons equivalent to that of a control panel on the Challenger space shuttle. So when a customer came into their stores to purchase higher-end audio-video hardware, it was important to have helpful and, even more importantly, knowledgeable salespeople, and whom they paid quite decently. The beginning of their end was when their CEO and executive board decided it was wise to lay off the vast majority of their well-paid and knowledgeable sales staff across all their locations and replace them with inexperienced, unknowledgeable new employees which they could pay minimum wage, or otherwise known as lowest amount legally possible. Then from that moment on, their sales started to plummet, and along with refusing to open an online presence for the sales of this new thing called the internet, might have a little bit of money involved with it, their chain eventually went out of business. So eBay used to be known for having very good customer service, having an on-demand, easily reachable, actually human service department to help should you have a dispute with an exchange like we had with this dishonorable female exit scamming us. But over the years, they have made themselves very difficult to contact directly. A sly and somewhat slimy technique that far too many corrupt sales websites engage in, where they work great if all is smooth, but when a challenge is faced, in their framework, mind you, they are not there to help you, and thus are sinking down into dishonorability. Trying to find any remnants of aid through the bones of what used to be their customer service or dispute center sends one on a loop of them telling you to contact the seller, putting the majority of the dispute resolution back on the relationship between the buyer and seller, which only really works if both parties are honorable. So if either the buyer or seller is exposed as being anything less, it also exposes the larger system they are inside is also exhibiting somewhat also less than honorable behavior. So the way we personally fixed this problem is we found a way to do it without sinking down into either the dishonorable behavior of the little or big head. Like many companies today, you can't get a real interaction with a real human being. Or if you do, it's in what we call in the inappropriately titled first world, a third world country. So in our navigating the loop-de-loops of their subsurface spiderwebs, which are intentionally difficult, many companies use that technique, especially in regards to long wait times with traditional phone support, hoping you will just give up, we dealt with this automated process in a way it was essentially asking to be dealt with. Luckily, the dishonorable woman who scammed us had not set the item to be non-returnable. So down in the loop-de-loops, we submitted a resolve ticket and got a refund via returning the item. After accessing the automated non-human helping page, we filed for a return and accessed a page to print out a return shipping label. And the genius woman had left her name and address in her account information, which is usually unavailable to be seen, but can now be accessed because a return was being issued. It was Claudia Cambreros, with an address in San Diego. That name obviously being of a woman of Latin American descent. So having seen glimpses of her physicality, we thought it might actually be her real name and not a made-up one. The only real issue now is that she had never actually sent us the item, and eBay's non-existent dispute resolution system had assumed she had actually sent the package in the mail. So without breaking any laws or sinking down into assholeness ourselves, we didn't want to send her anything threatening, a message of meanness or hate, or anything hurtful, anthrax in the mail, or disgusting, a turd log, or engage in any kind of mail fraud, but instead we kept it straight by putting a dirty rock in a box and mailed it back to her address with the tracking details, which eBay said they would refund once they confirmed the item, which was never actually really sent to us in the first place, mind you, had arrived back at her address and would then at that point reimburse us for it. So through this automated way, we sent the dirt-covered rock off in the mail, and by golly, it worked. So we got our money refunded. Not by her, but surely by eBay themselves. So multiple lessons were learned on this one. Firstly, to not engage with anyone who doesn't have some kind of previous track record, even if that's just a brief history of operating with at least one other review. Secondly, that the one large tech company we thought was halfway decent still is just as soulless as most of the rest of them. Honorable is a great word. It makes one have to stand on their own merits, and always shows that if someone is not honorable in their deeds and conduct, there are going to be many other negative aspects to their personality as well. But if one does stand in honor in all that they do, that speaks volumes about how they will operate in terms of the larger things in life.